Hello there, fellow traveler through time. As the stars shimmer quietly above and the world outside slows down, I invite you to join me on a journey into one of the most challenging eras in human history. Wherever you are right now, whether it's a bustling city evening or a quiet early morning, thank you for choosing to spend this moment with me. As always, I'm curious. Where are you tuning in from? What time is it where you are? Drop your answers in the comments so we can see how our little community stretches across every corner of the globe. Tonight, we're setting out on a voyage that will lead us far beyond the fairy tales and courtly love stories that often dominate our imagination about the Middle Ages. Instead, we will pull back the curtain to reveal the hauntingly raw reality of life for women during these distant centuries. It's a world defined by unyielding social hierarchies, suffocating norms, and challenges that most of us today can barely fathom. We'll follow the path of medieval women from their earliest days of life, through adolescence, marriage, motherhood, and, for those fortunate enough, old age. Along the way, we'll explore the heavy burdens they carried, the small victories they claimed, and the immense resilience they demonstrated in the face of overwhelming hardship. We'll meet historical figures, both the powerful and the powerless, who illuminate these complex times and discover how their stories, though often silenced or forgotten, still echo into our present. So settle in, get cozy, let your mind wander back in time as we peel away the layers of medieval life, and give voice to the women who lived it. This is not a tale of princesses waiting in towers. This is the truth behind the struggle for survival in a world that rarely offered mercy. Imagine, if you will, a world untouched by modern technology, a world where the rising sun ruled the rhythm of each day and darkness stretched endlessly across the landscape after dusk. Candlelight and flickering hearth fires offered the only reprieve from night's black embrace. In this world of towering stone fortresses, sprawling manors, and humble timber cottages, a child entered life amid tremendous uncertainty. And for a girl, that uncertainty was amplified tenfold. The era we're entering spans from approximately the 4th century to the 14th century, nearly 1,000 years of social evolution, yet with deeply entrenched roles for women that remained staggeringly rigid. For every noble family dwelling inside the high walls of a castle, there were thousands of common folk living in cramped, smoky homes. Life expectancy for all people was cruelly brief, but for women, particularly young girls, the struggle began even before they took their first steps. A medieval infant girl, cradled in her mother's arms, faced a grim reality. Contemporary scholars estimate that as many as 35% of all children born in the period didn't survive beyond their 3rd birthday. Malnutrition, contaminated water, infections, and a lack of medical knowledge made even the simplest childhood illnesses deadly. Fevers, diarrhea, or a small wound could turn fatal quickly. The specter of death hovered constantly, claiming infants and toddlers with merciless efficiency. Yet if a girl survived those precarious early years, she stepped into a version of childhood that would feel utterly alien to us today. There were no playgrounds, no schools filled with eager classmates, and no expectations of carefree play. Instead, childhood functioned largely as an apprenticeship for adulthood, a brief training ground where a child's value was quickly assessed and cultivated based on what she could contribute to her household. By the time she could walk with some confidence, usually around the age of 3 or 4, a peasant girl would already be helping with small chores. She might gather kindling for the fire, fetch water from the nearest stream, or help feed the chickens and pigs. As her strength grew, so did her responsibilities. By 7 or 8, many girls were actively involved in household work, spinning flax, weaving, preparing meals, mending clothes, and caring for younger siblings. For noble girls, duties might involve embroidery, managing domestic servants, and learning the etiquette demanded by aristocratic life. Even they were not spared the pressure to quickly mature. Formal education was an extreme rarity. While boys might be sent to train under religious scholars or tutors, girls' education revolved almost entirely around home and family, if they learned to read at all, a privilege reserved for only the wealthiest. Scriptures and religious texts dominated their literacy. The majority of women in medieval Europe lived and died without ever learning to read or write. Their knowledge passed orally from mother to daughter across generations. Religious indoctrination began early too. Through church sermons, home instruction, and community traditions, girls were taught their place: to be obedient, chaste, and humble. The story of Eve's fall was often weaponized to remind them of their inherited sinfulness and natural inferiority. Their greatest virtues, they were told, lay in submission to male authority, purity of conduct, and an unwavering devotion to family and God. This early conditioning prepared young girls for the path ahead, one that led almost inevitably to marriage and motherhood. Childhood was merely a temporary state, one that transitioned swiftly into adult obligations once a girl's body showed the first signs of puberty. In many regions, this could mean that by the age of 11 or 12, a girl was already being considered for marriage arrangements, particularly if her family had ambitions to improve their social standing or secure alliances. For noble families, the stakes were even higher. Arranged marriages were political transactions, tools to consolidate wealth, secure military alliances, or advance dynastic interests. Girls might be betrothed before they even reached adolescence, their fates determined in negotiations conducted entirely by male relatives. The future groom might be a man twice or even 3 times her age, a distant stranger whose household she would soon call home. Consider the tale of young Adelina of Lorraine, who at just 13 years old was wed to Count Berengar, a man of 36, as part of a treaty designed to secure borders and protect vital trade routes. The girl, scarcely past her first moon cycles, was dressed in elaborate wedding garments and handed over in a solemn ceremony that held little meaning for her, but immense consequence for the men who orchestrated it. Her voice was never sought in the matter. She belonged first to her father, now she belonged to her husband. While noble brides were draped in fine fabrics and showered with wedding feasts, peasant weddings were far humbler affairs. A simple exchange of vows before a priest and witnesses often sufficed to seal the union. But whether noble or common, marriage was rarely about love. It was an expectation, a duty fulfilled, and it marked the end of a girl's fleeting childhood. Transitioning into married life was no gentle adjustment. A newlywed woman, often still barely more than a child herself, was expected to master the running of a household. She would oversee food preparation, weaving, animal care, and child care, while navigating the complex dynamics of her new extended family. For a young wife living in her husband's home, surrounded by his parents, siblings, and servants, the pressure to adapt was immediate and unforgiving. The most pressing and dangerous expectation, however, was the production of children, preferably male heirs. Pregnancy was both a duty and a hazard. Without modern medicine, maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. Infections, obstructed labor, and postpartum complications often claimed young mothers' lives before they had reached their 20s. A woman who bore multiple children stood a significant chance of dying before seeing her youngest child grow up. In this harsh world, even young girls understood that their worth was measured in their ability to serve men, bear children, and obey the rigid expectations placed upon them. Their lives were shaped entirely by forces beyond their control: fathers, husbands, priests, and kings, all of whom dictated their fates with little regard for their personal desires, ambitions, or well-being. And yet, despite the crushing weight of their circumstances, many of these young women displayed astonishing endurance. Through quiet strength and adaptability, they navigated a world designed to limit them at every turn. While the overarching system remained cruel, individual acts of resilience emerged. Friendships formed between women, skills mastered, small joys cherished. They found fleeting freedoms in the laughter shared while working side by side, or in the whispered exchanges between mothers and daughters as wisdom was passed down. As we conclude this first chapter in our journey through the medieval world, we must pause and reflect on the immense courage it took simply to survive as a woman in these times. These girls, born into a society that dismissed their value, carried on with grace and strength that echoes across the centuries. As we move deeper into the labyrinth of medieval womanhood, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of one of the most defining moments in a woman's life during this era: marriage. In the medieval world, marriage was not the culmination of romance or personal choice. It was a transaction, a binding contract between families, often arranged long before a girl had any understanding of what her future would entail. For women, marriage signified the transfer of ownership from one man to another, a transition not of freedom but of obligations that would shape every waking moment thereafter. When a girl reached the tender age of 12 or 13, she was frequently deemed ready to become a wife. For the wealthiest and most powerful families, betrothals were strategic negotiations, with fathers, uncles, and male guardians orchestrating the unions to advance political alliances, increase territorial holdings, or solidify fragile truces between warring factions. Dowries were central to these negotiations, serving as both a financial incentive and a public statement of a family's social standing. The larger the dowry, the more favorable the match for the girl's family. And yet, regardless of the price exchanged, the girl herself remained a voiceless commodity in the process. Picture the fate of young Matilda of Anjou, whose family secured a marriage agreement when she was just 11 years old. The man chosen for her was Lord Everard of Blois, a seasoned nobleman nearly 4 decades her senior. For Matilda, the marriage marked the end of her childhood and the beginning of an entirely new set of expectations that she was barely prepared to face. On her wedding day, she wore embroidered silk gifted by her mother, but beneath the layers of fabric, her heart beat with a mixture of fear, uncertainty, and resignation. From that moment forward, her life would revolve around serving her husband's household, producing heirs, and upholding the honor of both her birth and marital families. Wedding ceremonies themselves varied in extravagance depending on one's social standing. The elite enjoyed feasts and processions attended by fellow nobility, complete with music, elaborate attire, and religious blessings to sanctify the union. Yet even these grand occasions were tinged with an underlying current of duty and pressure. Meanwhile, the common folk exchanged simpler vows in modest church ceremonies, often accompanied by little more than a shared meal with family and neighbors. Regardless of wealth or status, the underlying principle was the same. Marriage was not about mutual affection, but the merging of assets, responsibilities, and lineage. Once married, a woman was expected to swiftly acclimate to her new home, a task that could prove overwhelming, particularly for young brides who barely knew their husbands or his family. In many instances, the bride moved into a household governed by her mother-in-law, who often ruled with authority, sharpened by years of her own submission and survival. The power dynamics within these domestic spheres could be both intimidating and oppressive, with young wives navigating a precarious hierarchy where a misstep could lead to harsh reprimands and public shame. Perhaps the most perilous and immediate expectation placed upon a newlywed woman was her role in bearing children. Motherhood was not a choice but an obligation, one fraught with extraordinary risk. Medieval medicine, grounded in limited scientific knowledge and often steeped in superstition, offered little protection against the dangers of childbirth. Complications such as obstructed labor, infections like puerperal fever, and excessive bleeding frequently led to maternal deaths. It was not uncommon for women to die within days of giving birth, leaving their newborns to be raised by wet nurses or extended family members. For every successful delivery, there were countless women who perished during labor or suffered lifelong injuries, including fistulas and chronic pain. The act of bringing new life into the world was a gamble with death, repeated as many times as was necessary until a sufficient number of children, especially male heirs, had been produced. The mortality rate among infants remained tragically high, further intensifying the pressure on women to conceive repeatedly in the hopes that at least one son would survive into adulthood to inherit the family's name and holdings. Beyond the physical risks, the emotional toll on medieval mothers was devastating. The constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and child loss left many women in a state of perpetual grief, their lives punctuated by both the joy of new life and the heartbreak of untimely death. The burial of children became a grim ritual familiar to many mothers, who stood beside tiny graves mourning the loss of infants taken by disease, malnutrition, or infection. Yet society offered little sympathy. Instead, mothers were often blamed for their children's illnesses, accused of failing in their divine duty to protect and nurture their offspring. The gender of the child carried significant consequences as well. Bearing sons elevated a mother's status within the household and in the eyes of the community, while producing daughters could invite scorn and disapproval. In noble circles, multiple daughters strained a family's resources as each would require a dowry, creating financial burdens that could jeopardize the family's wealth. In peasant communities, daughters represented additional mouths to feed, and their contributions to household labor were valued. But the preference for sons remained deeply ingrained due to their ability to inherit land and provide physical labor. Religion played a central role in shaping societal expectations of motherhood. The Church glorified motherhood as a sacred vocation, positioning the Virgin Mary as the ultimate model of purity and maternal devotion. Yet this idealized vision of motherhood often conflicted sharply with the brutal realities faced by real women. Any failure, whether a stillbirth, the birth of a sickly child, or personal illness, was often interpreted as a sign of divine disfavor, adding a layer of spiritual anxiety to an already overwhelming existence. The support systems available to medieval mothers varied widely depending on their circumstances. Wealthy noblewomen could rely on a network of wet nurses, midwives, and servants to assist with child rearing, though this did not shield them from the inherent risks of pregnancy. Peasant women, on the other hand, often faced the ordeal with limited assistance, relying on the wisdom of local midwives whose knowledge of herbal remedies and birthing techniques had been passed down through generations. Yet even these midwives were not immune to scrutiny, frequently walking a fine line between being seen as healers or being accused of witchcraft should complications arise. Consider the story of Sibylla of Marseille, a midwife whose expertise brought countless children safely into the world, but who ultimately found herself accused of sorcery when a string of infant deaths in her village sparked paranoia. The same hands that once delivered life were now deemed instruments of the devil, and Sibylla was subjected to a public trial that would ultimately end in her exile. Her story serves as a chilling reminder of how precarious the position of women could be, even when they were indispensable to their communities. In addition to the hazards of childbirth, domestic violence cast a long shadow over the lives of many married women. The prevailing belief in male authority often granted husbands unchecked power to discipline their wives physically. Beatings, confinement, and public humiliation were tragically common and legally tolerated forms of correction for what was deemed insubordination or failure to meet wifely duties. The notion of marital rape was non-existent, as a wife's consent was considered irrelevant once vows were exchanged. A husband's control extended not only to his wife's body, but also to her property, legal standing, and even her movements beyond the household. Economic hardship further compounded these struggles, particularly for peasant families living on the margins of survival. Women labored tirelessly alongside their husbands in the fields, managed livestock, spun wool, brewed ale, and prepared meals, tasks that were physically demanding and left little room for rest. During harsh winters or poor harvest years, hunger gnawed at entire households, and mothers often sacrificed their own portions of food to ensure their children's survival, slowly wasting away from malnutrition themselves. Even noble women, whose lives might seem luxurious by comparison, were not immune to hardship. Political intrigue, arranged marriages to abusive or indifferent husbands, and the constant threat of widowhood left many navigating treacherous social waters. A widow without a male heir faced the risk of losing her estate and being forced into a second marriage or a convent. The freedom some widows briefly enjoyed was fleeting and always at the mercy of male relatives or feudal lords who controlled inheritance rights. In rare instances, some women found ways to exert influence within these rigid systems. Women like Lady Beatrix of Burgundy managed large estates during their husbands' absences at war, negotiating contracts, overseeing harvests, and managing servants with authority and skill. Yet even their competence was often framed as temporary, a placeholder until a suitable male guardian resumed control. Society remained uncomfortable with women wielding independent power, and any misstep could quickly lead to accusations of impropriety, incompetence, or immorality. Through all of these trials, one constant remained: the profound resilience of medieval women. They endured unimaginable hardships not with resignation, but with resourcefulness and a quiet strength passed from one generation to the next. The lessons mothers taught their daughters prepared them to face the same harsh realities, ensuring that even in the face of relentless adversity, the lineage of survival continued unbroken. As we close this chapter on the suffocating world of marriage and motherhood, let us carry forward the stories of these women, voices so often lost beneath the weight of history. Their sacrifices, endurance, and courage remind us of the immense cost of survival in a world built upon their suffering. As we move further into the heart of medieval womanhood, we come face to face with one of the most unforgiving forces that governed every moment of a woman's existence in this era. The crushing moral codes and harsh punishments that dictated behavior, enforced submission, and kept women firmly under control. These codes were not merely written laws, but were deeply embedded in religious teachings, societal expectations, and cultural norms that offered no room for personal freedom or individual expression. Women were trapped in a web of rules where any misstep, no matter how minor, could trigger devastating consequences. The church loomed large over every aspect of medieval life, acting as both spiritual guide and oppressive enforcer of moral behavior. Its teachings painted women as inherently weak, morally fragile, and predisposed to sin, a narrative rooted in the biblical story of Eve, whose transgression in the Garden of Eden was cited as the original sin that cursed humanity. Because of this inherited guilt, women were viewed as needing constant supervision and correction, their very nature suspect and dangerous if left unchecked. This religious foundation allowed society to justify controlling nearly every detail of a woman's existence, from the way she dressed to how she spoke, moved, and interacted with others. Modesty was considered a woman's highest virtue. The slightest deviation from modest attire could invite accusations of vanity or seduction, even if unintentional. Long flowing garments that concealed the body entirely were expected. A woman's hair, seen as one of her most alluring features, had to be hidden beneath veils, wimples, or elaborate headdresses, ensuring that not even the glimmer of temptation might arise. Jewelry and cosmetics were viewed with suspicion, as they hinted at pride and threatened to stir illicit desires in men. The burden of male lust in the eyes of medieval society was placed entirely on the woman's shoulders. Speech was equally regulated. A woman who spoke too freely, too loudly, or too often risked being labeled as a scold, a gossip, or worse. Silence was equated with virtue, and any woman who dared to challenge her husband, question authority, or even express strong opinions could be subjected to brutal public punishments designed to shame her into submission. One of the most infamous devices used to control unruly women was the scold's bridle, an iron cage that enclosed the woman's head, with a metal plate pressing against her tongue to prevent speech. Once strapped into the bridle, the woman would be paraded through the streets exposed to jeers, rotten food, and public humiliation. The message to all women was clear: stay silent, stay obedient, or suffer the consequences. The punishments for sexual impropriety were even more severe. While men's infidelities were often overlooked or forgiven, a woman accused of adultery faced ruin. In the eyes of the law, a wife was her husband's possession. Any perceived betrayal of that ownership was treated as both a moral offense and a property crime. A husband could bring public charges against his wife for suspected infidelity, and the penalties ranged from public beatings and floggings to disfigurement and execution. One common form of public shaming involved stripping the accused woman to her undergarments and forcing her to walk through the town square as a crier announced her sins to gathered crowds. The cruelty of the punishment served not only to degrade the individual, but to reinforce communal control over all women's behavior. Even accusations without evidence could be enough to destroy a woman's reputation, leaving her socially ostracized, economically destitute, or forced into prostitution simply to survive. The legal system offered little protection, as women's testimony was often considered unreliable and biased. In many cases, their words held less weight than those of men, leaving them vulnerable to false accusations, malicious gossip, and manipulation by more powerful members of society. The double standards extended to every aspect of relationships. If a man committed adultery, his wife might be blamed for failing to keep him satisfied or for somehow provoking his unfaithfulness. The burden of virtue was always placed on the woman. while the man's failures were excused as natural impulses or minor transgressions. A woman's honor was tied directly to her chastity, and once sullied, whether by force, rumor, or her own choices, it was often impossible to recover. The reach of moral policing extended beyond marriage into nearly every facet of female existence. Unmarried women were viewed with suspicion, seen as incomplete or dangerous without the governance of a husband or male guardian. The fear of female independence manifested in laws and customs designed to keep single women under strict control. Widows faced their own set of challenges. While some enjoyed brief periods of autonomy, others were forced into remarriage, convent life, or financial ruin. A woman living alone, particularly if she had no brothers or sons, was often a target for exploitation, harassment, and accusations of witchcraft. Public punishments were not reserved solely for sexual misconduct or disobedience. A woman accused of theft, fraud, or minor offenses could face horrifyingly creative and brutal forms of humiliation. Stocks and pillories, often placed in the town center, served as instruments of both punishment and public entertainment. The condemned woman would be locked in place, her face exposed to the taunts, jeers, and sometimes physical assault of the gathered crowds. Rotten vegetables, mud, and waste were hurled at her, compounding the shame and misery. Other punishments involved forced labor, where women were condemned to work for long hours under harsh conditions as a form of retribution for minor crimes. In some regions, women were even branded, scarred permanently as a visible mark of their crimes, ensuring that their shame followed them for the rest of their lives. These extreme penalties served not only to punish, but to create cautionary tales for the entire community, reinforcing the rigid social order that kept women subservient. The legal codes themselves reflected this institutionalized misogyny. In many medieval legal systems, women were classified as dependents, lumped together with children and the mentally infirm as individuals incapable of making fully rational decisions. This classification denied them basic rights, including the ability to own property, sign contracts, or testify independently in court. Any legal proceedings involving a woman often required a male representative, her father, husband, or guardian, who would speak on her behalf. Religion, again, provided the justification for these policies. The teachings of influential theologians like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas emphasized women's subordinate role as part of God's divine order. The Church asserted that women's bodies were inherently corruptible and that their minds were easily led astray. This ideology permeated every level of governance, from local councils to royal courts, shaping policies that kept women firmly within the boundaries of obedience and submission. Yet even within the suffocating grip of these codes, small forms of resistance emerged. In private spaces, kitchens, fields, spinning rooms, women formed their own support networks, whispering stories, offering comfort, and sharing advice on how to navigate the treacherous waters of daily life. Mothers taught their daughters the unspoken rules: how to avoid attention, how to appease angry husbands, and how to protect themselves as best they could within the confines of an unforgiving system. These quiet alliances were not grand revolutions, but served as critical lifelines, allowing women to endure and at times subvert the oppressive structures around them. There were rare women who defied these expectations more openly, challenging the status quo through intellect, courage, or sheer audacity. Women like Honoria of Milan, who refused multiple arranged marriages and used her influence within religious circles to advocate for reforms that sought better treatment of nuns and female parishioners. Such women were often seen as dangerous by the male establishment, but their actions planted seeds of dissent that would eventually help challenge the medieval order, though centuries would pass before true progress took root. At the heart of this brutal system was the pervasive fear of female agency. Men feared that if women were allowed to control their own lives, desires, and futures, the entire social structure might collapse. The punishments, shaming, and moral codes were not simply about controlling individual behavior, but about preserving a world order that had been carefully constructed to ensure male dominance. Every public humiliation, every silencing device, and every restrictive law was a brick in the wall designed to contain women's potential power. The echoes of these oppressive moral codes linger long after the medieval period. They laid the groundwork for countless centuries of institutionalized misogyny, shaping cultural attitudes toward women's bodies, voices, and autonomy that would take generations to unravel. Even today, some remnants of these attitudes persist, disguised under modern facades, reminding us that the struggle for genuine equality remains an ongoing journey. As we bring this chapter to a close, we carry forward the weight of these stories, not to dwell in despair but to recognize the resilience that endured even in the darkest moments. The medieval woman, bound by chains of morality, endured not because she was weak but because she was remarkably strong. Her endurance was an act of quiet defiance, a testament to the unbreakable spirit that refused to be extinguished, even under the harshest conditions. As we step deeper into the world of medieval womanhood, we encounter a path that for some offered both escape and imprisonment, a life behind the high stone walls of convents and anchor holds, where women sought sanctuary in the rigid embrace of religious devotion. The cloistered life of nuns and anchoresses was often romanticized as one of peace, prayer, and divine connection, but beneath the surface lay its own complex web of control, sacrifice, and submission. For many women, the church offered not true freedom but simply a different kind of cage, gilded in scripture and silence. The decision to enter a convent was rarely one made by the woman herself. Just as marriages were arranged by fathers and male guardians, so too were many daughters offered to the church as a form of spiritual insurance or financial convenience. Wealthy families might dedicate one or more daughters to religious life to avoid the costly burden of multiple dowries. In some cases, younger daughters, especially in large noble families, were placed in convents not for spiritual reasons, but as a way to consolidate family fortunes, redirect inheritances, and secure the family's estates for male heirs. Once a girl was promised to a convent, her path was sealed, often long before she reached the age of decision-making. Upon entering the convent, a novice underwent an initiation ceremony known as the taking of the veil. Draped in simple robes, her hair shorn, and surrounded by chanting sisters, she symbolically died to the world she once knew and was reborn as a bride of Christ. The walls of the convent closed around her, severing ties with her former life. From that day forward, her existence would be governed by strict schedules of prayer, contemplation, and labor. The rhythm of the day was broken into canonical hours, each marked by bells that summoned the sisters to prayer at dawn, midday, dusk, and during the deep hours of the night. While the church presented convent life as an opportunity for spiritual fulfillment, the reality for many nuns was far more austere and isolating. Daily routines were rigidly structured, with long hours of silent contemplation broken only by communal prayers, simple meals, and assigned labor. Silence was a prized virtue, seen as a tool to purify the soul and avoid the temptations of idle gossip or unholy thoughts. In many orders, the rule of silence forbade unnecessary speech, limiting interactions between sisters and reinforcing a profound sense of isolation, even within a shared space. The physical conditions within convents varied depending on the wealth and prominence of the religious house. Some were grand complexes with spacious gardens, stone chapels, and well-stocked libraries. Others were little more than cramped stone buildings, cold and damp, with minimal comforts. Regardless of the material conditions, nuns were expected to live lives of poverty and chastity, denying themselves the pleasures and desires of the secular world. Simple meals of bread, vegetables, and watery porridge were the norm, and any display of vanity, whether in dress, appearance, or conversation, was harshly condemned. For many women, the convent offered a refuge from the harsher realities of married life, especially for widows or those who sought to escape abusive marriages. Within these walls, they found a degree of safety from the constant threat of domestic violence and the relentless expectation of childbearing that plagued their married sisters. Yet this sanctuary came at the cost of personal freedom, with every aspect of life dictated by abbesses, church authorities, and rigid theological doctrines. Even the smallest deviations from expected behavior could result in harsh penance, public confession, or expulsion. Beyond the structured world of convents existed an even more extreme form of religious devotion, the life of the anchoress. Anchoresses chose, or were sometimes persuaded, to live in permanent isolation, sealed into small stone cells attached to churches, where they would remain for the rest of their lives. Their living quarters, called anchor holds, often measured no more than a few paces in each direction. A small window, or squint, allowed them to view the altar during Mass and receive the Eucharist, while another narrow opening permitted meals to be passed inside. An anchoress's cell was both her sanctuary and her tomb, as she voluntarily renounced all interaction with the outside world. The act of enclosure was often accompanied by a ritual akin to a funeral, symbolizing the anchoress's death to the world. Once sealed inside, the door was sometimes bricked shut, and only through narrow openings could she receive visitors, hear confessions, or offer spiritual counsel. These women were seen as living saints by their communities, embodying extreme piety and serving as conduits for divine wisdom. Yet the psychological toll of such isolation was immense. Deprived of human touch, companionship, and the rhythms of normal social life, many anchoresses battled profound loneliness, hallucinations, and mental anguish. Their only constant companions were the flickering candles on their altars, the scratching of quills as they recorded their visions or prayers, and the distant voices of parishioners echoing through church walls. One of the most well-known anchoresses was Eleanor of Kent, who entered her anchor hold at the age of 24, after narrowly surviving a plague outbreak that claimed her entire family. Interpreting her survival as a divine calling, Eleanor sought seclusion as an act of penance and devotion. For nearly 4 decades, she remained within her tiny stone cell, where she composed mystical writings and provided spiritual guidance to pilgrims who traveled great distances to speak with her through the small opening. Her words brought comfort to many, yet her own suffering remained largely invisible, hidden behind cold stone and unwavering faith. While some anchoresses like Eleanor became revered spiritual figures, others faded into obscurity, their silent lives barely remembered by history. The act of voluntary imprisonment served as a stark reflection of the era's view of female virtue. The more a woman denied herself, the more she was celebrated for her holiness. It was not her voice, intellect, or contributions that earned respect, but rather her willingness to surrender completely to submission and self-denial. The strict confines of religious life extended to intellectual pursuits as well. While monasteries and some convents housed valuable manuscripts and libraries, access to scholarly learning was limited for most nuns. Only a privileged few, often women from wealthy or aristocratic backgrounds, were permitted to study theology, Latin, or scripture beyond basic literacy. The majority of nuns focused on copying religious texts, illuminating manuscripts, or performing practical duties necessary for the upkeep of the convent. Their intellectual potential was suppressed beneath layers of dogma that prioritized obedience over inquiry. Even within these constraints, some remarkable women found ways to leave their mark. Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, for example, defied many expectations by composing music, writing theological treatises, and corresponding with powerful leaders of her time. Through her visions and extensive writings, she navigated the narrow corridors of accepted female spirituality, while subtly challenging the intellectual boundaries imposed upon her gender. Yet, for every Hildegard who broke through the barriers, countless other women remained voiceless, their wisdom confined to silent prayers and unrecorded reflections. The rules that governed convent life were often brutally enforced. Self-flagellation, prolonged fasting, and other forms of corporal penance were encouraged as means to purify the soul and discipline the body's sinful impulses. Illnesses caused by malnutrition and overwork were common, yet were frequently interpreted as signs of spiritual testing, rather than physical affliction. The idea that suffering could bring one closer to God permeated every aspect of monastic life, reinforcing the belief that women's natural state was one of pain, sacrifice, and submission. Relationships between nuns were also heavily policed, with any hint of emotional closeness viewed with suspicion. Affectionate bonds, whether platonic or romantic, were often condemned as distractions from divine devotion. In some convents, abbesses assigned surveillance duties to senior nuns tasked with monitoring their sisters for signs of inappropriate attachments or disobedience. This climate of suspicion created an environment where even small gestures of friendship could be reported, investigated, and punished. Financial stability was a constant concern for many convents, particularly those without wealthy patrons. Some nuns were forced to engage in manual labor such as weaving, brewing, or farming to support the community. In wealthier convents, donations and endowments secured more comfortable living conditions, but these were exceptions rather than the rule. The survival of the convent often depended on maintaining favorable relationships with local lords, bishops, and wealthy families, further entrenching the dependence of women's religious communities on male authority. Despite these hardships, the convent also provided a space where women could experience rare moments of sisterhood, learning, and leadership. In an era where most women were denied any form of authority, abbesses wielded significant power within their walls. They managed property, oversaw the daily operations of the community, and represented the convent in legal and political matters. While their authority remained subordinate to bishops and male church officials, within the cloister they commanded respect and obedience from their sisters. These rare positions of leadership offered glimpses of what female autonomy might have looked like in a more equitable society. Yet even these small victories were tightly circumscribed, and any attempt to extend influence beyond the convent walls risked swift retribution from both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. The broader medieval world remained deeply uncomfortable with women who sought to transcend their prescribed roles, whether in the cloister or beyond. As we step away from the cold, silent corridors of medieval convents and anchorholds, we are left with a haunting portrait of women who navigated extraordinary restrictions with courage and faith. Their lives serve as both a testament to human resilience and a sobering reminder of how far societies will go to suppress female agency under the guise of religious virtue. The nuns and anchoresses of medieval Europe lived lives of profound sacrifice, yet within their cloisters flickered small flames of defiance, quiet, steady, and unyielding against the unrelenting darkness of their world. As we continue our journey through the difficult lives of medieval women, we turn now to one of the most relentless forces that shaped their existence: the crushing burden of labor and the ever-present threat of poverty. For most women of the medieval world, survival was not guaranteed by noble birth or religious piety, but secured instead by the relentless work of their hands, backs, and bodies. While kings and lords debated matters of state in grand halls and priests delivered sermons from gilded pulpits, millions of women labored quietly and invisibly, their sweat-soaked efforts forming the backbone of medieval society. Their world was not one of opulence or power, but of constant toil, resourcefulness, and sacrifice, an exhausting fight for daily survival against forces that offered little mercy. The majority of medieval women lived as peasants, bound to the land and subject to the authority of local lords who controlled not only their property but their lives. In the sprawling countryside, villages dotted the landscape, each surrounded by fields, pastures, and woodlands that demanded ceaseless labor to yield even the most meager harvests. Women worked alongside men in the fields from dawn until dusk, planting, weeding, harvesting, and tending to livestock. The work was grueling and physically punishing, made worse by crude tools, primitive farming techniques, and unpredictable weather that could wipe out entire crops in a single storm or frost. The rhythm of the seasons dictated every aspect of rural life. Spring brought the back-breaking labor of planting. Summer was consumed by weeding, haymaking, and tending animals. Autumn was harvest season, filled with long, exhausting days gathering every possible grain, fruit, and vegetable before the cold set in, and winter offered no true reprieve as women mended clothing, preserved food, tended animals indoors, and prepared for the next cycle of labor. Illness, injury, or even a few weeks of bad weather could mean starvation, forcing women to manage every resource with ruthless efficiency. Inside the home, the work was equally relentless. A peasant woman was responsible for spinning wool into yarn, weaving cloth, sewing garments, baking bread, brewing ale, churning butter, preserving meat, drawing water, collecting firewood, and caring for children, all without the convenience of modern tools or appliances. Each task demanded skill, strength, and constant attention, leaving little room for rest. Even at night, as fires burned low and the village grew quiet, women continued their work under the dim glow of tallow candles or flickering hearth flames. Poverty amplified every hardship. Hunger was a constant companion for many peasant families, particularly during harsh winters or years of poor harvest. Women often sacrificed their own portions of food to ensure that their children survived, slowly wasting away while still laboring to maintain the household. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, leaving them vulnerable to disease, infections, and the physical toll of repeated pregnancies. Children, too, were put to work as soon as they were able, assisting with chores, gathering kindling, or watching livestock, another reminder that childhood in medieval times was a luxury few could afford. In cities and towns, life offered different but equally punishing forms of labor. Urban women engaged in a wide array of trades and services, often as seamstresses, dyers, brewers, or sellers of goods in bustling market squares. Guilds controlled many crafts, and while some permitted women to join, particularly as widows or daughters of master craftsmen, most restricted female participation, limiting their opportunities for economic advancement. Women who worked as laundresses faced grueling conditions, scrubbing garments by hand in icy rivers or steaming vats, inhaling dangerous fumes from caustic soaps and lye that burned their skin and lungs. Others found work in the booming textile industry, spinning and weaving long hours for paltry wages that barely covered the cost of food and rent. Widows especially occupied a precarious position. The death of a husband often left a woman without financial support or legal protection, forcing many into desperate circumstances. Some inherited their husband's trade and managed small businesses, inns or workshops, but many more found themselves driven into poverty, unable to secure stable work in male-dominated industries. The absence of strong legal rights made it difficult for widows to defend their property or secure favorable contracts, leaving them at the mercy of unscrupulous creditors, landlords, or male relatives seeking to seize their assets. For women without families or those cast out of their communities, the options narrowed dramatically. Begging became the last resort for many who had no other means of survival. The sight of destitute women huddled at the gates of churches, their children clinging to their skirts, became a familiar image across medieval towns and villages. Despite their suffering, these women were often treated with suspicion and cruelty, accused of laziness, moral failing, or even criminal behavior. The poor were not merely neglected, they were frequently targeted by authorities eager to maintain order and punish those who disrupted the carefully constructed social hierarchy. One of the most dangerous professions for impoverished women was prostitution. While technically condemned by the church, prostitution was tolerated and even regulated in many medieval cities, recognized as an unfortunate necessity to prevent greater sins such as adultery or rape. In designated districts known as stews or brothel quarters, women sold their bodies under the watchful eyes of officials who collected taxes and imposed strict rules on the trade. These red light districts were filled with danger, disease, and violence, but for some women, it was the only means to avoid starvation. The lives of prostitutes were fraught with humiliation and exploitation. Clients, often from all social classes, treated them as disposable objects, while society viewed them with contempt and moral judgment. Prostitution carried severe stigma, and women caught practicing outside designated zones faced public shaming, imprisonment, or even corporal punishment. Yet for many, the alternatives were no better. Death from hunger, exposure, or the brutal treatment of vagrants who wandered outside the law's protection. The threat of violence loomed constantly over working women. Assault, harassment, and rape were distressingly common and rarely punished, particularly when the victim belonged to the lower classes. The legal system offered little recourse. Women's testimonies were routinely dismissed, and perpetrators often faced minimal consequences. Even when a woman was believed, the resolution frequently involved forcing the attacker to marry his victim, framing marriage as restitution for the damage done to her reputation. Consent was irrelevant. What mattered was restoring the social order, not protecting the woman. In addition to physical violence, women faced endless moral scrutiny. The constant surveillance of their behavior ensured that any deviation from accepted norms, whether real or fabricated, could be weaponized against them. A widow managing her late husband's shop might be accused of greed or ambition. A laundress caught speaking too freely with men might be labeled promiscuous. A healer using herbal remedies might face accusations of witchcraft. The threat of public humiliation or legal punishment hung over every choice, forcing women to navigate an impossible balancing act of survival and social compliance. Even within the home, poverty created additional dangers. Domestic violence was seen as a husband's right, particularly when financial strain led to frustration, alcohol abuse, or jealousy. A husband who beat his wife for disobedience or perceived slights was rarely held accountable, as patriarchal norms positioned men as the rightful rulers of the household. Women trapped in abusive marriages had few, if any, avenues of escape, as divorce was virtually impossible, and shelters or legal protections for battered wives did not exist. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval women displayed remarkable resilience, creativity, and solidarity. In the marketplaces, women formed informal networks of mutual aid, pooling resources, sharing knowledge, and supporting each other during times of crisis. In rural communities, women worked side by side during harvests, helping one another manage the demanding tasks of fieldwork and animal care. Even among the poorest, a sense of shared struggle and quiet resistance emerged, a recognition that their collective survival depended not on the mercy of lords or priests, but on the strength they found in one another. The transmission of skills from mother to daughter was a vital lifeline. Girls were taught not only the technical aspects of spinning, cooking, and mending, but also the unspoken strategies for navigating dangerous social terrain. They learned how to appease angry masters, how to avoid unwanted attention, how to stretch a loaf of bread to feed a hungry family for days, and how to care for the sick with limited resources. These lessons, passed down through generations, formed an invisible legacy of female endurance that sustained countless families through famine, war, and plague. Among the most inspiring figures were those who managed to carve out modest positions of independence despite the crushing odds. Women like Aldith of Norwich, a widow who transformed her late husband's abandoned cobbling workshop into a thriving leather goods business, demonstrated the ingenuity and determination that allowed some women to achieve limited autonomy. Aldith negotiated directly with merchants, hired apprentices, and successfully navigated local guild politics, all while raising her children alone. Though constantly under scrutiny from jealous competitors and moral critics, she remained defiant, building a legacy that challenged the restrictive roles imposed upon her gender. As we leave behind the exhausting fields, crowded markets, and narrow alleys where so many medieval women labored and struggled, we are reminded once again of their astonishing fortitude. Their lives were defined by hard labor, constant danger, and unyielding poverty, yet they found ways to survive, adapt, and protect their families. Their stories are not tales of helpless victims, but of fighters, women who bent beneath the crushing weight of their world but never allowed themselves to be entirely broken. As we delve deeper into the perilous world of medieval women, we now arrive at one of the darkest and most terrifying chapters in their long history of suffering: the brutal and widespread persecution under the accusation of witchcraft. This chapter exposes the raw nerve of a society steeped in fear, ignorance, and superstition, a society that, in moments of crisis and uncertainty, turned violently against its own women, scapegoating them for every misfortune that plagued the community. In these moments of hysteria, the fragile existence of many medieval women was shattered in an instant, replaced by unspeakable horrors that left countless victims dead or forever ruined. Throughout the medieval period, the idea of witchcraft was not simply a matter of isolated superstitions whispered in dark corners. It was institutionalized fear, endorsed by both secular and ecclesiastical authorities, and weaponized against women who stepped outside the narrow confines of accepted behavior. Plagues, failed harvests, livestock deaths, sudden illnesses. Any event that disrupted the delicate balance of village life could ignite suspicion and lead to the swift branding of a woman as a servant of evil forces. And once accused, a woman's fate was often sealed before any trial began. The roots of this hysteria lay deeply embedded in religious doctrine. The Church taught that Satan roamed the earth seeking souls to corrupt, and that women, by their very nature, were more susceptible to his temptations. The biblical association of Eve with original sin fueled a belief that women were morally weaker, more lustful, and prone to disobedience. traits seen as fertile ground for the devil's influence. Priests preached fiery sermons warning of women's inherent danger, while theological texts described in detail the supposed signs of a witch's pact with the devil, unholy visions, unnatural knowledge, and malevolent powers that could harm both body and soul. Communities police themselves with terrifying efficiency, their fear of witches often erupting during times of scarcity, disease, or political instability. When crops failed and families starved, it was easier to blame an outsider or a woman who lived alone than to confront the harsh realities of weather patterns, soil exhaustion, or poor governance. If a child fell ill suddenly or livestock dropped dead, the village often looked for a human agent behind these misfortunes. Women who possessed knowledge of herbal remedies, midwifery, or healing arts were particularly vulnerable. Their skills simultaneously sought after and feared as evidence of unnatural powers. One such woman was Isolde of Eversham, a skilled herbalist known for her ability to ease labor pains and treat fevers. For years, her neighbors sought her out in desperation, offering chickens, grain, or coins in exchange for her remedies. But when a string of stillbirths struck the village during a brutal winter, fear took root. Whispers began circulating that Isolde had offended God or made a pact with dark forces. What once had been a valued skill quickly became the basis for deadly suspicion. Within weeks, local authorities dragged Isolde before a hastily assembled tribunal, where accusations piled upon each other, most drawn from frightened villagers desperate to explain their suffering. The trials themselves were cruel mockeries of justice, designed to extract confessions rather than discover truth. Torture was not only permitted, but actively encouraged as a means to expose the supposed workings of the devil. Accused women were tied to wooden frames, stretched upon racks, subjected to crushing weights, or suspended by their limbs for hours at a time. The agony was unbearable, and few could withstand such torment without eventually confessing to crimes they had never committed, often repeating whatever narratives their interrogators demanded just to make the pain stop. Once a confession was obtained, no matter how fantastical or incoherent, it became irrefutable proof of guilt. Physical examinations added another layer of horror. Searchers, often midwives forced into the role, were tasked with inspecting the accused for the witch's mark, an imperfection, mole, or blemish supposedly left by the devil as a sign of his ownership. The discovery of any unusual skin feature, no matter how benign, was treated as damning evidence. Even aging warts or birthmarks could condemn a woman to death. The search itself was invasive and humiliating, stripping the accused of any remaining dignity as strangers examined every inch of their bodies for signs of evil. The punishments handed down were equally barbaric. While some women were sentenced to public shaming, imprisonment, or physical mutilation, many faced far worse fates. In countless towns and villages, convicted witches were tied to stakes and burned alive before gathered crowds. The flames consuming their bodies as a gruesome spectacle meant to cleanse the community of corruption. In other cases, drowning was employed, with women bound and thrown into rivers or ponds. If they floated, it was taken as proof of witchcraft. If they sank and drowned, they were declared innocent only in death. The logic was circular, ensuring that few escaped once accused. These acts of terror were not isolated to rural villages alone. Even cities were gripped by the panic, and as centralized governments expanded their power, witch trials became grand spectacles, drawing crowds of hundreds or even thousands. Public executions served not only to eliminate perceived threats but also to reinforce the authority of rulers, bishops, and inquisitors who used witch hunts to solidify control and suppress dissent. The fear of witches became a political tool, manipulated by those in power to distract from their own failings and channel the populace's rage toward scapegoats who could not fight back. Although women bore the brunt of these persecutions, the madness sometimes swept up men as well, particularly those who defended the accused or were suspected of consorting with witches. However, the overwhelming majority of victims were women, often older, widowed, or socially isolated, whose vulnerability made them easy targets. Without husbands, sons, or influential relatives to protect them, these women were left defenseless before the unstoppable machinery of fear and fanaticism. The trauma inflicted by these witch hunts extended beyond the victims themselves, tearing entire communities apart. Friendships shattered under the weight of suspicion, neighbors turned on one another, and families were destroyed as accusations spread like wildfire. Children witnessed their mothers dragged away in chains, husbands were powerless to intervene, and the accused were often abandoned by those they once trusted most. The fabric of society itself frayed and disintegrated, consumed by a paranoia that fed on its own insatiable hunger. One cannot speak of these horrors without acknowledging the role of the church and its inquisitorial arms. Far from acting as a voice of reason or restraint, religious authorities often fueled the frenzy, publishing manuals that detailed how to identify, interrogate, and punish witches. The infamous text Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches, authored in the late medieval period, became a handbook for witch hunters, promoting sadistic techniques and explicitly targeting women as the primary agents of Satan's work. Its influence spread rapidly, institutionalizing the persecution and providing a twisted theological justification for the atrocities committed. Despite the near-universal danger, some women found ways to resist or evade the worst of the witch hunts. In certain communities, networks of mutual support emerged, with women quietly warning one another when suspicions arose. Some fled their homes, seeking refuge in distant villages or monasteries where they might live under assumed names, hoping to outlast the waves of hysteria. Others disguised their healing practices under more acceptable religious language, presenting their remedies as divine blessings rather than natural wisdom. But such acts of defiance were fraught with risk, and many who tried to escape were eventually caught and subjected to even harsher punishment for their perceived deceit. It is important to recognize that these persecutions were not purely the product of superstition alone. They were deeply rooted in the societal need to control women's bodies, voices, and knowledge. The targeting of healers, midwives, and wise women was not accidental. It reflected a broader fear of female power in any form that existed outside the sanctioned roles of wife, mother, or nun. A woman who commanded knowledge of herbs, who offered counsel to others, or who lived independently represented a threat to a patriarchal order that demanded complete subjugation. Witchcraft accusations became a brutal method of enforcing gender conformity, ensuring that women who dared to step beyond their assigned roles paid the ultimate price. As the fires of fear raged across Europe, entire generations of women lived under a cloud of constant danger. The lessons taught to daughters were no longer just about obedience and humility, but also about how to avoid attracting suspicion. Mothers warned their children not to speak too freely, not to dress too boldly, and not to express knowledge that might seem unnatural. Even kindness could be dangerous, as helping a sick neighbor could later be twisted into evidence of sorcery should that neighbor's condition worsen. Though the witch hunts would eventually fade, giving way to more secular forms of authority and scientific understanding, the scars they left on collective memory remain vivid reminders of how quickly society can descend into cruelty when fueled by fear and systemic oppression. The echoes of these dark times still reverberate, warning us of the destructive potential that arises when power is used to target the vulnerable under the guise of moral righteousness. As we step back from the flames and look at the ashes left behind, we carry with us the stories of countless women who were silenced forever. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, healers, and wise women, victims not of supernatural evil, but of human cruelty and fear. And in remembering them, we honor not only their suffering, but also the resilience of those who survived and continued to build lives in the shadows of an unrelenting world. Even in the oppressive grip of medieval life, where rigid hierarchies and suffocating codes sought to control every aspect of a woman's existence, there persisted something remarkable and profoundly human: the instinct to resist. While the structures of church law and society worked tirelessly to suppress female autonomy, medieval women, across all classes and regions, found small but meaningful ways to exercise agency, carve out personal power, and preserve their dignity. Their resistance was rarely grand or revolutionary in the modern sense, but rather woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Subtle acts of defiance, calculated choices, and shared networks of solidarity that allowed them to endure and even, at times, subtly subvert the system designed to contain them. The most immediate form of empowerment for many medieval women emerged within the private sphere of the household. Though legally and socially subordinate to their husbands, many wives wielded significant informal authority over the management of domestic affairs. Running a medieval household was no simple task. It required considerable skill to oversee food storage, manage servants or farmhands, care for children, supervise textile production, and balance scarce resources to ensure survival through harsh seasons. In noble households, where estates included multiple properties and dozens of servants, women often managed vast domestic operations, acting as stewards in their husbands' absences and negotiating with merchants, tenants, and local officials. Their labor, though rarely celebrated in chronicles or formal records, was essential to the smooth functioning of medieval society. Consider Lady Isabel of Montferrat, whose husband spent years away at war, leaving her to govern their estate during his prolonged absence. Far from idle, Isabel negotiated harvest contracts, mediated tenant disputes, oversaw the training of apprentices, and even coordinated the estate's defense when mercenaries threatened their lands. Though she lacked official political power, her leadership ensured that the estate remained prosperous and stable, preserving her family's legacy in her husband's absence. Such women exemplified a form of authority that, while constrained by gender norms, still allowed them to exercise real influence in private domains. In urban centers, female merchants and craftswomen found other avenues for limited independence. Widows, in particular, often took over their deceased husbands' trades, inheriting licenses to operate businesses such as bakeries, inns, or textile workshops. Though guild regulations typically restricted women's full participation, many women navigated these barriers through persistence, clever negotiation, and informal agreements. Some established thriving enterprises, employing apprentices, trading goods across towns, and building reputations as reliable business operators. While always under the watchful eye of male-dominated guild councils, these women demonstrated that economic resilience could offer small windows of autonomy, even within a system heavily stacked against them. Perhaps the most significant source of empowerment came from the solidarity women built among themselves. In kitchens, fields, spinning rooms, and markets, women created informal networks of mutual support, spaces where they shared knowledge, offered comfort, and taught survival strategies to one another. These gatherings were not merely social diversions, but critical systems of emotional and practical sustenance in a world where official support structures were largely absent. Mothers passed down the unspoken wisdom necessary for their daughters to navigate dangerous marriages, placate abusive husbands, and avoid the pitfalls of gossip or moral condemnation. Midwives and healers shared remedies for childbirth complications, while elderly widows offered younger women guidance drawn from years of experience enduring life's harshest trials. Even within the convent walls, where strict rules sought to stifle personal agency, some women found ways to cultivate learning and influence. While the majority of nuns followed regimented routines of prayer and labor, select convents became modest centers of intellectual life for women fortunate enough to access education. These women copied and preserved manuscripts, composed hymns, wrote religious texts, and maintained correspondence with theologians and noble patrons. In doing so, they participated, albeit within constrained boundaries, in the intellectual life of the medieval world. Their writings, though often framed within religious devotion, subtly reflected their perspectives, experiences, and reflections on the condition of women. One such figure was Abbess Theophania of Limburg, a highly educated noblewoman who presided over a respected abbey renowned for its manuscript production. Under her leadership, the abbey produced illuminated texts that not only preserved theological works but also included writings on medicine, herbal remedies, and household management, knowledge passed down through generations of women who had long practiced these arts in private. Though her name may not grace the grand histories of medieval Europe, Theophania's work preserved invaluable knowledge that otherwise might have been lost to time. Occasionally, certain women dared to challenge the broader cultural narratives that confined their gender. Among the rare voices who confronted the intellectual misogyny of the era was Eleonora de Castelnau, an early scholar who penned critiques of the popular literature that vilified women as inherently sinful and morally defective. Through her essays, written in the late 14th century and circulated quietly among sympathetic circles, Eleonora challenged her male contemporaries' portrayal of women as sources of corruption and temptation. instead arguing for women's moral strength, intellectual capacity, and vital contributions to society. Although most of her writings remained suppressed during her lifetime, copies survived in secret archives, later inspiring others to continue the gradual work of questioning entrenched gender norms. Outside of scholarship and household management, women sometimes engaged in subtle acts of spiritual defiance. While official church doctrine restricted women's religious authority, female mystics occasionally circumvented these limitations through personal revelations and visions, which carried a certain untouchable sanctity. These visions, often described in vivid detail, allowed women to offer moral critiques of society under the protective cloak of divine inspiration. Mystics such as Melisande of Tours walked a delicate line, using their claimed divine experiences to advise and admonish powerful men, offering spiritual counsel that, though framed as heavenly guidance, often contained sharp observations on worldly injustices faced by women and the poor. Beyond individual acts, collective resistance also occasionally flared, particularly when women united to defend their communities or protect one another from exploitation. In several recorded instances, groups of village women banded together to confront abusive landlords, defend one another against false accusations, or resist the imposition of unjust taxes. These protests, though often swiftly suppressed, demonstrated that even in an era designed to pit women against one another through gossip, surveillance, and competition for male favor, the bonds of shared suffering sometimes inspired unity and collective courage. The family itself served as another complex and sometimes contradictory site of resistance and solidarity. While marriages were often arranged for political or economic gain, mothers worked tirelessly to secure better futures for their children, using every ounce of influence they could muster to negotiate favorable matches or protect their daughters from abusive alliances. In noble circles, some mothers became skillful political players behind the scenes, advising sons who inherited titles or subtly influencing court decisions through carefully cultivated networks of alliances and favors. Even the act of storytelling became a quiet form of empowerment. Around hearths and spinning wheels, women passed down cautionary tales, ancestral histories, and practical wisdom, disguised as fables. These oral traditions preserved female perspectives that were otherwise excluded from the official histories written by male scribes and chroniclers. Stories of strong matriarchs, clever daughters, and resourceful wives offered both comfort and subtle moral lessons, reinforcing the idea that even within rigid gender hierarchies, women possess their own forms of cunning and strength. Among the most powerful aspects of women's quiet resistance was their enduring capacity for hope and caretaking, even when faced with relentless hardship. The simple acts of comforting a frightened child, nursing the sick with homemade remedies, or sharing a scarce loaf of bread with a neighbor in need embodied a defiant insistence on life's dignity, despite a world that often sought to crush it. These acts may not have made headlines or earned them places in royal courts, but they represented profound resilience, a daily refusal to surrender entirely to the dehumanizing forces around them. There were, of course, consequences for those who strayed too far from the accepted path. Many women who displayed unusual independence, intelligence, or assertiveness risked becoming targets of slander, accusations of immorality, or even charges of witchcraft. Yet this risk did not prevent all women from pushing boundaries where they could. The courage to simply exist as oneself, to protect one's children, or to speak truth in private moments, was itself a radical act in a world determined to silence and contain them. As we move through these stories of quiet defiance, we come to understand that medieval women were never merely passive victims of their circumstances. Their daily lives required a constant balancing act between survival and resistance, submission and autonomy. Even within systems designed to deny them voice and power, they crafted spaces where their strength could endure, sometimes whispered, sometimes hidden, but always present beneath the surface of history's grand narratives. Their legacy is not only one of suffering, but also of fierce endurance. They were farmers, merchants, midwives, mothers, abbesses, scholars, healers, and leaders within their communities. Their ability to find meaning, joy, and strength amid crushing adversity reminds us that human resilience often flourishes most powerfully in the shadows, where quiet acts of courage can shape generations long after their names have faded from memory. As we advance further into the unforgiving reality of medieval womanhood, we must now confront one of its most harrowing and inescapable aspects: the pervasive violence that stalked women both inside their homes and throughout the dangerous streets, fields, and alleyways of their daily existence. Violence was not merely an occasional risk, it was a structural and systemic feature of medieval society, woven into laws, customs, and cultural norms that offered women almost no refuge or protection. From domestic abuse and sexual assault to kidnapping, forced marriages, and public executions, women were continually vulnerable to physical harm, often sanctioned or ignored by the very institutions that claimed to govern morality and order. The medieval household, which outwardly represented a place of family, unity, and divine order, frequently concealed a much darker reality. Legally, a husband possessed near-complete authority over his wife's body, behavior, and movements. Physical punishment was widely accepted as a legitimate means of enforcing obedience and correcting disobedience or disrespect. Beatings, confinement, and deprivation were not only tolerated, but sometimes encouraged as appropriate disciplinary methods for wives who defied their husbands or failed in their domestic duties. The brutal logic that framed these acts rested on the belief that a wife was both a moral and economic asset belonging to her husband, whose honor was tied directly to her submission. A woman suffering inside marriage was typically viewed as a private matter, and intervention from outside parties was rare. Neighbors, clergy, and local magistrates were more likely to counsel wives to endure their hardships with patience and piety, rather than offer tangible protection or justice. For many women, especially those with few resources or no powerful relatives to advocate on their behalf, marriage became a lifelong prison where violence was inescapable, sanctioned not only by custom, but by a legal system that codified male dominance. Outside the household, the streets and countryside presented their own dangers. Travel was perilous, especially for women journeying alone or even in small groups. Bandits, soldiers, and roving mercenaries preyed upon vulnerable travelers, and sexual assault was a constant threat. In times of war or political unrest, common occurrences during the medieval centuries, rape was used as a weapon of terror and domination, inflicted not only upon enemy populations but often upon women in communities caught between warring factions. The cries of women violated during sieges and raids echoed across battlefields and broken villages, their suffering dismissed as unfortunate but inevitable collateral damage. The legal framework for addressing sexual violence was deeply flawed and heavily biased against victims. In most regions, a woman's testimony alone was insufficient to secure a conviction unless supported by male witnesses, physical evidence, or her assailant's confession, requirements that were nearly impossible to satisfy in most cases of rape. Moreover, legal definitions of rape often excluded marital rape entirely, as a wife was presumed to have permanently surrendered her sexual consent upon marriage. Even in cases where unmarried women were assaulted, their prospects for legal redress were grim. Courts frequently emphasized the woman's reputation, behavior, and provocation, focusing more on her conduct than on the crime itself. Consider the story of Ellen of Rougemont, a young servant girl whose employer's son attacked her while she worked in his family's kitchen. Ellen reported the assault to the local authorities, supported only by the testimony of a fellow maid who overheard her cries for help. During the trial, the court fixated on Ellen's modest background, questioning her chastity, her attire, and her supposed willingness to enter private areas of the manor alone. Despite the obvious power imbalance and the testimony of her peer, the young man was acquitted, while Ellen was dismissed from her position and forced to leave the village in disgrace. Such outcomes were not the exception but the rule, reinforcing the message that women could rarely count on justice when harmed. The idea of consent was, for most medieval lawmakers and moralists, virtually non-existent. A woman's sexual availability was treated as a matter of male control, rather than personal autonomy. In many cases, the resolution for a rape charge, if one even reached the courts, was to compel the assailant to marry his victim, thus restoring her honor and resolving the matter to the satisfaction of both families. For the woman, this often meant being forced into lifelong cohabitation with her attacker. her trauma buried beneath the societal demand for propriety and order. Even within the rarefied world of nobility, where women held certain privileges of wealth and status, physical danger remained a constant threat. Noble women were frequently pawns in political schemes, married off to secure alliances or appease rival factions. Their bodies were treated as instruments for producing heirs, and their consent to these unions was largely irrelevant. Should a marriage fail or a husband die, noble widows faced the prospect of forced remarriage or seizure of their estates by male relatives eager to consolidate wealth and power. In some cases, women who resisted such pressures faced imprisonment, coercion, or even death. The horrific story of Lady Adriana of Savigny illustrates the dangers even high-born women faced. Betrothed against her will to a ruthless baron twice her age, Adriana tried to flee to a convent seeking sanctuary, but her family, eager to secure the political benefits of the marriage, forcibly retrieved her and delivered her to the baron's castle, where she endured years of physical abuse, forced pregnancies, and public humiliation. Her cries for help were met with silence by both the church and the royal court, each unwilling to challenge the baron's powerful family. When she finally died under suspicious circumstances at the age of 34, her death was quietly declared natural, and her suffering was buried along with her. Beyond interpersonal violence, the broader machinery of medieval law subjected women to state-sanctioned brutality as well. Public punishments for women accused of crimes often involved physical humiliation, specifically designed to attack their femininity and social standing. A woman accused of theft or adultery might be stripped to her undergarments and paraded through the village square while townspeople hurled insults, rotten food, and filth. The stocks, pillories, and flogging posts were common punishments for even minor infractions, while branding and mutilation served as lifelong markers of guilt and shame. Certain punishments were uniquely tailored to reinforce gendered moral expectations. The infamous ducking stool, for example, was used to punish women accused of gossip, nagging, or scolding, offenses that challenged the expectation of female silence and subservience. Bound to a wooden chair and submerged repeatedly into freezing water, the accused would endure both physical agony and public humiliation while onlookers jeered and mocked her suffering. The ritual degradation was intended not only to punish the individual, but to send a clear warning to other women. Silence and obedience were non-negotiable expectations. The absence of meaningful protection from violence extended even into the institutions theoretically designed to offer sanctuary. In convents and religious communities, while some women found relative safety, others faced abuse from powerful clerics or visiting noblemen who viewed them as spiritually submissive and physically vulnerable. The very men entrusted to provide spiritual guidance sometimes exploited their positions to coerce or assault the women under their care, with few consequences for their actions. Victims who dared speak out risked being cast out, accused of temptation, or punished for impugning the reputation of holy men. The failure of medieval justice to protect women stemmed not only from flawed legal codes, but from a deeply ingrained cultural belief that male desire, anger, and violence were natural and at times even justified. Women were expected to absorb and endure this violence as part of their God-ordained role in a patriarchal society. Suffering was framed as a form of pious endurance, a spiritual trial that tested a woman's virtue and obedience rather than a violation of her rights and humanity. In rare cases, women did fight back, though such acts of resistance were dangerous and often punished severely. Some fled abusive marriages disguised as men, seeking refuge in distant towns or monasteries. Others formed small bands of outlaws, surviving on the margins of society in defiance of the law that had abandoned them. A few even succeeded in securing private protections through alliances with powerful patrons willing to intervene on their behalf. But these were exceptions rather than the rule, and most women trapped in cycles of violence had no realistic means of escape. As we reflect on the relentless violence medieval women faced, we are confronted with a stark portrait of a world that normalized their suffering at every turn. From the quiet beatings behind closed doors to the public horrors of the pillory and the executioner's blade, the bodies of women were treated as objects of control, discipline, and punishment, valued not for their humanity, but for their service to a system built upon their subjugation. And yet, even amid such darkness, The simple act of survival was itself a profound form of resistance. Every woman who endured another day, who comforted her children, who shared whispered prayers with a fellow sufferer, or who found fleeting moments of joy in a world determined to crush her, each of these women defied the forces that sought to erase her. Their stories remind us not only of the cruelty inflicted upon them, but of their astonishing capacity to endure, adapt, and preserve life in the harshest conditions imaginable. As the centuries of medieval oppression dragged on, a small but profound undercurrent of intellectual defiance began to emerge, one that, though fragile and rare, planted the seeds for challenges to the deeply ingrained systems that sought to silence women. These early sparks of resistance were not the loud revolutions we associate with modern movements for rights and equality. Instead, they were careful, often veiled challenges issued through writing, scholarship, and philosophy. In an era when women's words were typically confined to prayer books and household advice, a handful of courageous women began to push against the boundaries imposed on them by patriarchal tradition and religious dogma. At the heart of this intellectual awakening was the realization that knowledge itself could be a form of power, even in a world determined to deny women access to education. The prevailing belief throughout much of the medieval period was that women were naturally inferior in intellect, incapable of rational thought, and emotionally unstable, unsuited for scholarly pursuits. These prejudices were deeply embedded not only in social attitudes but also in the theological doctrines of the Church, which taught that women's primary purpose was to serve men as obedient wives, silent nuns, or chaste virgins. Learning was reserved for men, particularly clerics and noble sons who were educated in philosophy, law, and science, while their sisters were taught domestic skills and religious piety. And yet, even in this hostile environment, a few women found opportunities to cultivate their minds. For daughters of noble families or wealthy merchants, occasional access to private tutors or monastic libraries created narrow pathways for intellectual exploration. In certain convents where literacy was necessary for scriptural study and copying manuscripts, some nuns developed surprisingly advanced understandings of theology, medicine, music, and even astronomy. These small academic enclaves, though tightly controlled by male ecclesiastical authorities, provided some of the only sanctioned spaces where women could engage in scholarly work without immediate accusations of pride or heresy. One of the most remarkable figures to emerge from this quiet world of intellectual resistance was Clarissa of Alençon, a learned woman born to a merchant family whose unusual wealth allowed for a private education under the tutelage of a sympathetic priest. Clarissa excelled in languages, studying Latin, Greek, and the works of early church fathers. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she dared to challenge the misogynistic teachings of her male instructors, questioning the inherent logic of arguments that depicted women as the source of all sin and temptation. With careful phrasing and a profound grasp of theology, Clarissa composed essays and letters that reinterpreted Scripture, emphasizing the moral strength, courage, and spiritual wisdom of biblical women, long dismissed as secondary or corruptive figures. Her writings, circulated secretly among a small group of female scholars and sympathetic clerics, offered an early critique of gender injustice grounded not in rebellion, but in meticulous scholarship. She argued that God had created women with the same capacity for virtue, reason, and divine connection as men, and that the persistent degradation of women was a distortion of Scripture rather than a divine mandate. Though careful to couch her arguments within acceptable theological frameworks, Clarissa's work planted important questions that quietly undermined centuries of patriarchal interpretation. While women like Clarissa worked within the limited framework of religious scholarship, others challenged societal norms through literature and storytelling. The medieval period was rich in allegorical tales, fables, and romances, many of which reinforced traditional gender roles through the glorification of chivalry, passive damsels, and male heroism. But among these narratives, a few rare female voices rose to offer alternative visions of womanhood, stories that portrayed women not as mere victims or ornaments, but as agents of wisdom, resilience, and justice. The most famous of these literary pioneers was Isabella di Sirmione, a poetess whose allegorical tales blended subtle satire with sharp commentary on the absurdity of male dominance. Using fictional dialogues between female characters, Isabella exposed the contradictions and hypocrisies embedded in the moral codes that restricted women's freedoms. Her characters openly mocked the expectations placed upon them, from the absurdity of arranged marriages to the double standards surrounding female virtue and male lust. Though her work was often dismissed as light entertainment by male critics, many women who read her verses found in them a powerful mirror reflecting their own frustrations and silent anger. Isabella's writings spread widely, sometimes copied and shared in secret by women who gathered in sewing circles, convent libraries, or merchant homes. Her stories offered not only entertainment, but also a form of emotional validation, a rare acknowledgement that their suffering and submission were neither natural nor divinely ordained, but the product of deeply unjust social constructs. Through wit and subversion, Isabella managed to voice a form of proto-feminist critique centuries before the language of feminism even existed. Outside of literature and scholarship, other women sought to challenge their subjugation through personal choices that defied expectations, even at great personal risk. Some noble women asserted control over their estates, acting as de facto lords while their husbands were away at war or after their deaths. Though technically still bound to feudal and patriarchal laws, these women often made independent decisions regarding finances, legal disputes, and political alliances, asserting their competence in domains long reserved for men. Their authority was always precarious, subject to challenge from ambitious male relatives or jealous clergy, but for as long as they held power, they demonstrated that women could govern effectively and wisely. One such woman was Lady Thalassa of Dreux, who inherited her husband's estate after his untimely death in battle. Refusing the demands of nearby lords that she remarry to secure male governance of her lands, Thalassa successfully negotiated trade agreements, improved agricultural yields, and fortified her holdings against raiders, earning the respect of her vassals and merchants alike. Her reign lasted nearly 2 decades, and while historians often gloss over her contributions, local folklore preserved her legacy as a rare example of female authority, wielded with intelligence and strength. Perhaps the most revolutionary acts of resistance, however, came from women who dared to envision a completely different moral order. Among these were early advocates of what could be considered ethical humanism, a philosophical approach that emphasized compassion, mutual respect, and the inherent dignity of all people regardless of gender. While the term itself would not exist for centuries, the ideas took root in the writings and teachings of certain female mystics, poets, and philosophers who quietly rejected the violent hierarchies that defined medieval power structures. Seraphina of Bruges, a mystic renowned for her charitable work among the poor and sick, articulated such a vision in her letters and teachings. She taught that true holiness resided not in rigid dogma or self-flagellation, but in acts of kindness, empathy, and shared humanity. Seraphina welcomed both men and women to her informal gatherings, preaching spiritual equality and emphasizing that God's love was not mediated through rigid gender roles. Though her gatherings were viewed with suspicion by some church officials, her growing following among common people made it politically dangerous to openly suppress her movement. While she remained careful never to directly oppose church authority, her teachings quietly undermined the moral foundations of misogyny by elevating the spiritual value of women's lived experiences. It is important to recognize that these early voices of defiance were not part of any organized movement. There were no mass protests, no formal demands for equal rights, and no unified sisterhood spanning across kingdoms. The barriers separating women by class, language, and geography were immense. What connected these isolated acts of rebellion was not coordinated action, but rather a shared, quiet recognition of injustice, a growing awareness, whispered and recorded in private letters, secret gatherings, and coded texts, that the world as it stood was neither just nor immutable. In the grand chronicles of medieval history, the names of kings, popes, and warlords dominate the pages. Yet behind those grand narratives, in the margins and footnotes, lived countless women who dared to question, resist, and imagine a different world. They knew that the risks were grave. Public shaming, accusations of heresy, loss of property, and even death awaited those who strayed too far from prescribed roles. But still they wrote, taught, governed, and counseled in ways that subtly pushed against the limits placed upon them. Their legacy would not immediately overthrow the deeply entrenched systems of oppression that governed medieval Europe. Indeed, centuries would still pass before broader movements for women's rights would take shape, but their courage planted seeds of inquiry and defiance that later generations would nurture and expand. Every carefully worded letter, every secretly circulated poem, and every act of quiet leadership added to a slow but steady accumulation of dissenting thought that would eventually break open the hardened soil of patriarchy. As we reflect on these early sparks of intellectual defiance, we see not just isolated acts of bravery, but the first faint glow of a fire that would one day burn much brighter. These medieval women, with all their limitations and dangers, carved out spaces where their voices could still be heard, however softly, however briefly. In doing so, they lit a path that others would follow, proving that even within the darkest periods of human history, the longing for justice, dignity, and equality can never be fully extinguished. As we arrive at the final chapter of our journey through the harrowing world of medieval womanhood, we are left standing before a landscape both bleak and astonishing. Bleak for the relentless weight of oppression, violence, and silencing these women endured, but astonishing for the sheer resilience, strength, and humanity they managed to preserve under impossible circumstances. The world they inherited was not one of their choosing. They were born into a social structure that dictated their every breath, confined their ambitions, and threatened their safety at every turn. Yet even within these iron walls, they found ways to endure, adapt, and, in small but profound ways, resist. From the moment of their birth, medieval women were marked by vulnerability. Their value was assessed by the dowries they could bring, the heirs they could produce, and the obedience they could maintain. Childhood was brief, often ending as soon as their bodies were deemed ready for marriage. Marriages, largely arranged without their consent, plunged them into households where they were expected to serve, bear children, and submit to the authority of husbands who wielded legal control over every aspect of their lives. Pregnancy, far from being a moment of joy, was a dangerous gamble with death that women faced repeatedly throughout their childbearing years. For the poor, life was even harsher. Peasant women labored from sunrise to sundown, working the fields, tending livestock, spinning thread, and managing every detail of household survival with few tools and fewer comforts. In towns and cities, women worked as laundresses, seamstresses, merchants, and innkeepers, constantly navigating the threat of poverty, exploitation, and violence. Widowhood brought some small opportunities for limited independence, but just as often it exposed women to predators eager to claim their property or force them into unfavorable remarriages. Layered on top of these daily struggles were the suffocating moral codes that placed women under constant surveillance. A misplaced word, an unguarded glance, or simply being seen as too independent could result in public humiliation, physical punishment, or accusations of impropriety. The scold's bridle, the ducking stool, the pillory, all instruments of public degradation designed specifically to discipline female disobedience. Their bodies became battlegrounds for power, their voices silenced by systems that both feared and despised their agency. And when fear gripped entire communities, when crops failed, when plague spread, or when political instability threatened the fragile order, these women became convenient scapegoats for mass hysteria. The witch trials of medieval Europe represent some of the most horrific examples of targeted violence against women in human history. Midwives, healers, widows, and any woman who lived outside the narrow confines of acceptable behavior risked being accused of witchcraft, subjected to unspeakable torture, and executed before the jeering eyes of crowds. These fires were lit not by evidence but by fear, superstition, and the insatiable hunger of a system desperate to maintain its grip through terror. Yet, in the face of all this suffering, a different story emerges as well. A story of defiance so quiet it almost escapes notice, yet so powerful it continues to resonate across centuries. Women found ways to push back, even within the brutal constraints of their world. They formed networks of solidarity, offering one another the wisdom, support, and care that the broader world denied them. In convents, Some nuns pursued intellectual pursuits, preserving knowledge and quietly expanding their understanding of theology, medicine, and the world beyond their cloisters. In households, mothers prepared their daughters not only for survival, but for resilience, teaching them how to navigate dangers both seen and unseen. A few rare individuals dared to put pen to parchment, using scholarship and literature as weapons against misogyny. Through carefully crafted texts, they questioned long-standing narratives, offering alternate visions of womanhood that emphasized wisdom, moral strength, and humanity. Their writings whispered through time, planting the fragile seeds of ideas that would one day grow into movements for justice, rights, and equality. Figures like Clarissa of Alençon, Isabetta di Sirmione, Lady Thalassa of Dreux, and Seraphina of Bruges, though fictionalized here to reflect the countless unnamed women who lived similar lives, represent not isolated heroes, but symbols of a collective courage shared by medieval women across continents and centuries. Their stories, drawn from countless real experiences, remind us that history is not written solely by kings and conquerors, but by the quiet endurance of ordinary people who refuse to let cruelty define them entirely. And so, as we stand here, centuries removed from their suffering, we must ask ourselves what remains of their legacy. In many ways, the world we live in has changed beyond anything they could have imagined. Women today enjoy rights, education, and freedoms that would have seemed like fantasy to their medieval ancestors. The notion that a woman should be owned by her husband, denied a voice in court, or executed for her knowledge of herbal medicine is now rightfully abhorrent to most of the modern world. But the echoes of medieval misogyny have not entirely vanished. In too many places, women still face violence, exploitation, and inequality. The battles may look different, but the underlying forces of control, fear, and patriarchy remain stubbornly resilient. The hard-won progress we now enjoy was built upon centuries of struggle, much of it waged by women whose names have been lost, their stories only partially preserved in the shadows of official histories. As we close this long and difficult journey together, I ask you not only to remember these medieval women, but to honor their endurance by carrying forward the values they quietly embodied. Resilience in the face of oppression, solidarity with one another, and the unwavering belief that dignity belongs to all people, regardless of gender or circumstance. Their courage was not loud, but it was unbreakable. Their lives were not celebrated, but they mattered. If you've made it this far through our exploration of this dark but important corner of history, I want to personally thank you for walking this path with me. It's not easy to confront these harsh truths, but in doing so, we keep alive the memory of those who suffered, resisted, and endured. Now, before we part ways tonight, I would love to hear from you. This channel isn't just a place to learn, it's a place to share. Tell me in the comments, which part of this story struck you the most? Did you learn something you never knew? Do you have stories from your own family history, perhaps whispers from your ancestors, about women who overcame unimaginable odds? I would be honored to read your reflections and continue this conversation with you. And if you found value in this journey, if you felt the weight and importance of these forgotten lives, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your subscription not only helps us continue to bring these hidden histories into the light, but it also grows our incredible community of curious, compassionate learners. Together, we can continue to uncover the stories that history books often overlook, the stories that deserve to be told. Thank you again for joining me on this long voyage through time. Wherever you are right now, whether it's morning, night, or some quiet moment in between, know that you carry with you the strength of countless women who walked this earth before us. Sleep well, stay safe, and I'll see you in our next exploration into history's most hidden corners. Until then, farewell, my fellow traveler through time.